Hey, Willie, let's take a sharp turn to domestic politics for a second. I was just seeing a poll out last night from NBC News that certainly casts, just reflects on the debate that's coming up on Kavanaugh when he goes before the United States Senate. Roe v. Wade, this NBC poll had support for Roe v. Wade at 71%. A majority of Republicans now even say they don't believe that Roe v. Wade should be overturned. Should Roe be overturned? No, 71%. Yes, 23%. Willie, I know that that's been the dream of conservatives for years, to get 5 judges on the court that will overturn Roe v. Wade. But that's a 45-year precedent. That's a 71% approval number. And that's going to be a heavy, heavy lift for any judge going onto the court. And a heavy lift for anybody that wants to go onto the court with those sort of numbers.
Yeah, look at these numbers. You mentioned it inside the numbers. Among Republicans, 52% support the Supreme Court ruling in Roe versus Wade, 76% among independents and 88%, as you might expect, under Democrats. So, Heidi, as you sort of look at the whip count here, as you travel around Capitol Hill and see who will vote for Kavanaugh, who won't, there are obviously Republicans feel like they have the votes, but there are those couple wiggle votes, Susan Collins and a couple of others. Is this in peril at all for President Trump? Is there any chance that Kavanaugh is not seated here?
We've been looking to Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, and I think we've known the answer to that at least a week or two ago. We would have expected them to come out in stronger opposition to whoever the candidate is going to be, to signal that this may be in peril. Now, the one vote that has actually looks in question is Rand Paul, based on privacy concerns, but I don't think that that's going to, in the end, pose any danger. I think he is trying to draw attention to what has been a long-standing issue. I do think that Roe will be a huge issue during the confirmation hearings. I don't expect Kavanaugh to answer the question, right, but we can go ahead and look at his previous writings about kind of executive power. We can look at his previous writings about referring to abortion in a recent case that he ruled on as, quote unquote, abortion on demand, which is the language used by a lot of the anti-abortion crowd. But I think at the end of the day, Willie, a lot of Democrats know that the real risk to Roe is not necessarily a direct overturning of Roe, but it is the upholding of the flurry of restrictions that are being passed at the state level, which would essentially, if allowed to stay in place, render Roe irrelevant in a lot of states. So you could just see big disparities in terms of state level access to abortion.
Yeah, and you know, when we look at the senators who may or may not support Kavanaugh, Jim VandeHei, let's just not even put Rand Paul on this list. He does this every time. I'm going to vote against this. I'm going to vote against that. And he always ends up lining up behind the president. He always ends up supporting Donald Trump blindly. He's going to vote for Kavanaugh. It's a joke for him to even, any reporter that thinks he's not really seriously should look into another profession. He's going to vote for Kavanaugh. The question, though, is, Jim, you've got 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats who are still trying to figure this thing out. Of course, we've talked about Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, but you also have Heidi Heitkamp and you have Joe Manchin, and you almost get a sense that those 4 are going to vote as a block one way or the other. They're all going to either vote against Kavanaugh or all either vote for Kavanaugh and provide each other a little bit of cover.
Yeah, and I think if you listen to what they've had to say and you look at their past, it's much more likely that they all vote for him than they vote against him. It's much more likely that he picks up Democratic votes than it is that he loses Republican votes. And again, once you get into the hearings on this and he's getting grilled, he obviously knows the abortion question's coming. He obviously knows how to handle that in a public setting. And so I don't think there'll be enough out there to convince Republicans, even moderate Republicans, to turn against him. And you have these Democrats sitting in these states, and not just the 2 you mentioned. You've got basically 10 seats occupied by Democrats. And if you look at Trump's numbers in those states, they're basically what they were on Election Day. He remains relatively popular in those states. He remains probably a political asset to Republicans in those states. So that's a lot of pressure to put on those members, and they have to have a real justification for going against if people think he's a qualified candidate for the court.
Yeah, and Mike Barnicle, though, you take, well, not only Joe Manchin in West Virginia, but Heidi Heitkamp. You can also talk about Susan Collins in Maine. And you now have the question of whether Obamacare is, if reviewed again, would be deemed as constitutional, because now they've stripped away that tax that John Roberts, what John Roberts called a tax. And so the issue of pre-existing conditions suddenly comes up. And for a guy like Joe Manchin, it's going to be awfully hard for Joe Manchin to vote for a judge that would rule Roe v. Wade to be unconstitutional. Not Roe v. Wade, that would rule Obamacare to be unconstitutional. There are a lot of issues that affect a lot of voters that this fifth vote is going to determine, a lot more than just abortion.
Yeah, I mean, this story has a couple of different tracks to it, Joe. As Heidi just accurately pointed out, what's going on in various state legislatures around the country is going to do more to diminish access and make it more difficult to get access to women's health than anything that happens in the next few months with the hearings. The other aspect, the other track that is really interesting is, look, to be realistic about it, to just follow the barometer that is going on in Washington right now, Judge Kavanaugh is going to be confirmed. He is going to sit on the Supreme Court, which raises the larger question, what are the Democrats going to do in pursuit of winning the House in 2018 and winning the presidency in 2020? Where are they going? What direction is the Democratic Party headed in?
Hey, Jim VandeHei, before we send you off on your way today, what are you looking at as we look over the horizon at Axios today?
Yeah, in terms of bad news for Trump, like putting aside all the tweet stuff, today, the House is looking worse and worse for Republicans. You've got now the two leading handicappers of these races, people who study the districts, putting way more Republican seats in play. And so you now have all the ingredients that it would take to have a wave that would put Democrats in control, because you have 60-plus seats that are in play. Almost all of those are Republican. You have Democrats outraising Republicans in many of these seats, which should never happen when you're when Republicans are the party in power. And you have Democrats showing in race after race that they have record turnout, which is a great indicator of sustained momentum. And so in terms of things that Democrats can be hopeful about, the House is looking better and better. The Senate still difficult as can be for Democrats.
All right, Jim VandeHei with Axios. Thanks so much as always, Jim. We'll see you soon. Still ahead on Morning Joe, back to the administration's accusations against public servants. Former officials do make money off their considerable experience. The key word in that sentence is former. We'll compare how that legitimate practice contrasts with some of the money-making ventures from current White House officials, from Ivanka Trump's clothing line to Jared Kushner's family business. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.